Hello, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. We're thrilled to welcome the nearly 700 of you that have pre-registered to this Forest Trend Supply Chain and Innovation Forum co-hosted webinar to discuss the 2016 Supply Chain Report. Throughout today's webinar, we will provide a deep dive into the findings of this report, and we will also hear from a series of expert guest speakers about the reflections from the report and insights about how they are working at their organizations towards the shared goal of ending deforestation from commodity value chains. Before we begin, I would like to first thank our partners, CDP and WWF, as well as our steering committee and our supporters, the Global Environment Facility and the United Nations Environment Program. Also, we are very appreciative of the efforts of our webinar co-host, Innovation Forum, which we have collaborated on not only for today, but the many events that they hold across the globe where they convene on this topic. We'll hear from their founder, Toby Webb, just a little bit later on in this webinar. So my name is Stephen Donofrio, and as the Senior Advisor of Supply Chain, I've been working with the team here since the project's inception in early 2014, leading project innovation and strategy development, partnerships, and stakeholder relationships. I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to work with such a diligent and intelligent supply chain team, which I credit greatly for all the excellent research and analysis that you'll hear about today. While we aim to provide the best possible content and platform for our stakeholders, we're always seeking to understand how to continue to develop it to meet the needs and interests of our audience. So please contact me should you wish to discuss how your organization can extract the insights from the platform and how we might be able to work together at some point in the future. It's been just about a year since we launched Supply Chain at the end of March in 2015, and we did this with the specific aim of tracking progress reported by companies that make pledges to reduce deforestation in their supply chains. Our goal is to provide a transformational resource for businesses, investors, governments, and the civil society organizations that support and hold them accountable, providing real-time information as much as possible on the extent and value of commitment-driven commodity production and demand. What we aim to find out is who are these companies, what's working for them, and what we can learn from them, as well as what progress have they achieved towards reducing deforestation linked to their supply chains in palm, timber and pulp, soy, and cattle. So what's new in 2016 since 2015? Well, we've continued to grow and deepen our commitment database that companies have reported. And last year, when we published our first report at the end of March, this was based on 307 public commitments from 243 companies. Just 1 year later, we've made a significant amount of progress and are now tracking 579 public commitments from 366 companies. But with this more robust data set, the realities of these companies and their commitments are becoming more and more clear. Some are positive, while others signal that more needs to be done. Most of the companies that have made such commitments are headquartered in North America and Europe, far away from where the commodity-related deforestation is actually taking place. They also tend to be large, publicly traded companies dealing in food products and operating downstream in the consumer-facing manufacturing and retailing levels of global supply chains. However, despite the pledges to remove deforestation from the supply chains, public information on tangible steps towards achieving these goals is available for only 1 in 3 commitments. So, transparency around commitments provides valuable knowledge to those who are working diligently to raise awareness of corporate deforestation risks. Transparency also provides the data that shows what works for those companies that are being proactive enough to commit to reducing deforestation and its related impacts. Standardization of reporting is also critical, and that's why CDP is partnered up with the Carbon Disclosure Project, now CDP. Supply chain scours all publicly available information to synthesize this information and effectively pull these companies towards change. Finally, we very much applaud the efforts of these 366 companies that have both set and then publicly reported their commitments. However, we have also found 200 companies without commitment details being reported, which signals either that they do not have a commitment, or if they do, they're not willing to share information about it. Further, we encourage all companies to update their stakeholders on their progress along the way. So before moving on into the deep dive presentation of the report's findings, which Ben McCarthy will provide, I would like to thank our guest speakers for being with us today. And they are Jillian Gladstone, who is the Manager of Forest at CDP North America, Marco Albani, who is the Director of the Tropical Forest Alliance 2020, and Ignacio Gavilan, who is the Director of Sustainability with the Consumer Goods Forum, and then finally, Toby Webb, who is the founder of Innovation Forum, our co-host for today's webinar. So I'll wrap up the webinar today by moderating a Q&A segment. So please feel free to send those questions to the chat box throughout the webinar. We'll get to them after the speakers have presented, and I should note that any questions we're unable to get to live, we will aim to follow up by email afterwards. Lastly, it's good for you to know that this webinar will be recorded and distributed afterwards. If you have any questions to follow up with us on, please do not hesitate to contact us. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Ben McCarthy, who is the Senior Associate of Supply Chain, for him to walk us through a deep dive of the report findings. Thank you, and on to you, Ben.
Hi, Stephen. I do want to as well thank the Innovation Forum for hosting the event, to our actual supporters, as well as my fellow panelists for their contributions to this important topic. We're very pleased to have so many of you on the line, and I look forward to an active discussion later in the webinar. Excellent. So to begin the conversation, I'm here to talk a bit in depth about our new report, which draws out insights from our data set as of March 31st of this year, and builds on our first report published in March 2015. In this new report, we look at the status of and trends in corporate commitments to reduce deforestation from their supply chains, and we were thrilled to be able to publicly launch this report last month at the Global Landscapes Forum in London. Here's what we knew when we started the supply chain project. Commercial agriculture drives at least 70% of tropical deforestation, with more than a third of the total, an area about the size of Switzerland, attributable to the big four commodities. As of the writing of this report, supply chain has tracked 566 companies that have supply chains dependent on one or more of these big four. These companies were identified because of participation in multi-stakeholder roundtables, declarations related to commodity deforestation, or inclusion in scorecards, rankings, or evaluations conducted by third parties. For each of these companies, our small team reads through publicly available information, which includes company websites and annual reports, CDP Force disclosures, and progress report submissions to commodity roundtables, among many other sources. We do this to determine which companies have public commitments to reducing deforestation impacts, and then catalog the related policies and actions they are taking. For this report, we analyzed 366 companies that had made one or more public commitment, and each of those have a public profile on supply-change.org, which is freely and publicly available for use. For your use, we invite you to visit it. Many companies have more than one commodity in their supply chain, and as such, we identified a total of 579 commitments from those 366 profiled companies. However, a company does not necessarily have a commitment for each commodity it buys or sells. Information for which commodities a company is active in and has a commitment toward is available on its individual company profile page. The first question we asked ourselves about the hundreds of commitments was which commodities received the most attention. We compared those companies that either buy or sell each commodity with those that have a corresponding commitment towards sustainability. The full bar shown here in this figure shows us that how many companies are active in each commodity. The darker bar shows us how many companies have a commitment to reduce deforestation with that commodity. We found that there's a gap in the likelihood to make commitment between palm and timber and pulp on one side and soy and cattle on the other. The good news is that the majority of companies have active in palm and timber and pulp have made a commitment, have made their own commitments. However, significantly fewer companies that are active in soy or cattle have made similar commitments. This is cause for concern because the numbers are exactly opposite of the deforest impacts by commodity. The latest commodity deforestation data is from a December 2015 study in the Journal of Environmental Research Letters. The circles above the bars here represent the hectares of forest loss associated with each commodity. As you can see, cattle causes 10 times the deforestation associated with palm. This is a disturbing realization. Of course, we recognize that deforestation by itself does not account for all conservation factors. High carbon stock areas and peatland protection are notable examples of other important factors. When supply chain launched about a year and a half ago, we didn't have a clear sense of how commitments were structured. We wanted to understand the degree of commonality between commitments and where they were different. So we started recording an explicit mention of more than a dozen metrics within company commitments. The metrics include goals and policies such as protection of high conservation value areas and requiring free, prior, and informed consent that add specificity to the company's overall commitment and help move a company toward commitment implementation. This figure lists all of the procurement policies we track along the bottom. The bars going up from each metric give the percentage of commitments that include the metric in the commitment text. They're color-coded by commodity with palm in blue, timber and pulp in brown, soy in green, and cattle in orange. The average for all commitments is given on the leftmost bar for each grouping. Going backwards here, just a moment. Excellent. The full figure for this report, or excuse me, including the commitment goals, is on page 9 of the report. What we found is that sourcing and procuring of commodities with certification is the most often cited policy metric across all commodities except for cattle. More than 80% of palm and timber and pulp commitments include a requirement for certification. While certification serves as a clear baseline for commitments, many companies go further than the requirements set by standard bodies to establish additional policies. Here we can start to make some interesting comparisons to the research snapshot of 307 commitments researched from our first report. Of the 85 commitments made in 2015, the order of importance of the metrics stayed the same. That is, the order from left to right in this figure didn't change. But in every case, the percentage of inclusion within commitments went up. For example, mention of traceability went up to 51% overall from 40% in our previous report. This demonstrates an increasing similarity among commitments, a convergence on the factors that civil society considers important, and a recognition that deforestation commodity issues go beyond environmental impacts. In their seminal report, Disturbing the Global Commodity Business, the Climate and Land Use Alliance proposed that commodity commitments need to be ambitious, geographically defined, and time-bound. So, of course, we asked ourselves how many of these commitments we track are time-bound. The figure in this figure is a distribution of commitments announced in 2014 and in 2015. For each bar, the announcement year is on the left, and the target year is on the right. The darker colors indicate a greater number of commitments that share that same announcement and target year. The count of commitments in each grouping is noted in the bubble on the left. For example, 56 commitments were announced in 2014 with a target year of 2020, and 10 commitments were announced in 2015 that aimed to achieve their goal in that same year. Again, the full figure for all announcement years is on page 12 in the report. The important finding here is that 66% of commitments have a target date, which is a decrease compared to the 79% of commitments that were time-bound in Supply Chain's first report. So we're seeing an increase in the overall percentage of those commitments with no set target year. Not surprisingly, most time-bound commitments, 24% that is, set 2020 as the target date regardless of their announcement year, which is likely due to efforts such as the New York Declaration on Forests, the Consumer Goods Forum, and the Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 that have all set group targets for 2020. The biggest question around all of these commitments is whether or not companies are actually achieving their goals. The first step to finding that out is to ensure companies publicly disclose information on their progress. About 1 in 3 commitments have information on progress available. Each of those companies should be commended for being transparent with their stakeholders, but the level of disclosure needs to improve overall. Looking at it of the commitments we track into one of the 6 categories that are listed here in the figure. The disclosure percentages and total numbers for each category are shown. Categories are assigned based on the intent of the overall commitment goal, or said another way, the top line ambition. These categories include 3 relating to certification along the top here, to procure or produce physically certified supplies, to purchase certificates or credits that support sustainable production without actually sourcing certified supplies, or some mix of both. To be clear, these categories are distinct from the procurement policy metrics which we looked at just 2 slides previously. Progress disclosure rates for these 3 categories of commitments, as you can see, range from 41 to 54%. The other 3 categories may include certification as a metric, but overall they aim to achieve 0 or 0 net deforestation, traceability, or other things such as substituting or eliminating the use of the commodity. Information on progress is less often available for these commitments, and as you can see is about 25%. Disclosure progress provides an opportunity to celebrate success as well as to reflect on lessons learned when aspirations are not met. Jillian will be highlighting the benefits to companies of disclosing environmental data next in the panel. So, getting greater disclosure is a priority for stakeholders, but what do we know about the progress information that is available? We averaged the most recently reported progress within those same 6 categories. As we can see, despite the wide variance in disclosure rates, average reporting of achievement is relatively consistent and high, which is good. The average toward the overall goal across all commitments with progress information is 74%. However, the contrast of low disclosure rates and relatively high achievement reporting begs the question, do companies only disclose progress when it's good news? We also wanted to take a closer look at commitments with the target date of 2015 and earlier. There are 136 such commitments where the target date has passed. Encouragingly, the overall disclosure rate is higher for these commitments. About half have progress information available. However, we know that not all of these commitments have been met because the average reported progress is only 82% toward the overall goal for those 136 commitments. Supply chain will be looking into different aspects of reported progress throughout this year to get a clear sense of the overall, clear picture of the overall commitment achievement. So to conclude, change is happening. We've seen advancement on the issue of reducing deforestation in corporate supply chains, even within just the last year. From an increasing similarity in commitment structure and metrics to improvement in disclosure over time. Change is incremental, though. Standards and certification schemes are often the first step for many companies towards sustainable supply chains. Development, even though they may go further and increase their ambition later. So development of nascent schemes for soy and cattle should be supported, and established schemes for palm and timber and pulp should be improved. change is worth communicating. Given the level of stakeholder engagement on these issues, it's in a company's best interest to communicate progress towards its commitment. And finally, change needs to be measurable. Communicating progress is important, but so is a common framework for how to measure that progress. So we hope that this report helps to inform stakeholder decisions and advance the transition to deforestation-free supply chain. I look forward to the responses from the other speakers and to the reactions and questions from everyone who has joined the discussion. Thank you very much, and Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. And there you guys see the quick snapshot of the website, which is supply-change.org, which, just to remind everybody, is a free-to-use, publicly accessible platform. So feel free to hop on there afterwards if you've not yet already. And if you do have any questions, need any help around filtering and sorting and searching for companies specifically, please do not hesitate to contact us. So the next part of this presentation is going to be our speaker Jillian from CDP North America. Jillian is the manager of the forest program out of North America. So I'm just going to pass this along to you. Actually, I'll retain the presenter rights, Jillian, and Leah, if you could just unmute Jillian, that would be great. Jillian, if you could just test the microphone. Yep.
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear. Okay. So
Great.
just let me know when you want to move on to the next slide, and we'll take you there.
Very good. Thanks so much to Ben and Stephen for including CDP today and to Innovation Forum for hosting us. Stephen, you can go ahead to the next slide. Hi there. As Stephen said, my name is Jillian Gladstone. I lead CDP's forest work in North America, and I work directly with companies that are requested to disclose environmental information through CDP's Force Questionnaire. So, as those on the line may know, CDP, or formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, provides a global system for companies and cities to measure, disclose, manage, and share vital environmental information. CDP holds the largest collection globally of primary climate change, water, and forest risk commodities information. And we work with markets to put these insights at the heart of strategic business, investment, and policy decisions. So we're really happy to be partnering with Supply Chain to do just that. A number of the data points highlighted on the Supply Chain profiles are derived from information companies report publicly through CDP's Force Questionnaire. You can move to the next slide. This year, we'll likely have more than 200 companies from across the globe and from across supply chain functions as well, using CDP's Force Questionnaire to disclose information to their stakeholders, including through supply chain. The formal signatories to CDP's request are the 365 institutional investors that request information so that they can understand the risks and opportunities that companies are facing related to their management of the key agricultural commodities driving deforestation. Specifically, our forest program collects disclosures from companies on how they're approaching, managing, and mitigating deforestation risk, both in their operations and in their supply chains. And we have 7 years of corporate data on the key agricultural commodities. CDP also facilitates a platform through which companies are making a commitment to end deforestation. Along with other groups, including Ceres, the Climate Group, BSR, and WBCSD, we've formed the We Mean Business Coalition to create a central platform for businesses to step forward and commit to meaningful action on climate change. Over 400 companies have taken over 750 actions collectively to date, and one of these actions is to remove commodity-driven deforestation from all supply chains by 2020. The 51 global companies that have signed on to this commitment are recognized for that in their supply chain profiles, and those commitments are included in the data covered in the supply chain report. One thing to note is this is a cross-commodity commitment. And as Ben just explained, the number of commitments covering soy and cattle are low compared to palm and timber, but they're so vital given the outsized role Ben showed us that cattle production plays in driving deforestation as compared to other commodities. The CDP Force Questionnaire aims to do a couple of things. First is to provide a logical structure that guides companies through the journey of removing commodity-driven deforestation from their value chain and improving their understanding of deforestation-related risks. It also facilitates greater and more robust disclosure while reducing reporting burden and producing responses that lend themselves to effective engagement between external stakeholders and companies, very much in the way that Supply Chain is doing with this report and through their profiles, by allowing companies to demonstrate progress in good practice, as well as allowing stakeholders to identify and engage with companies that aren't taking action. The program emphasizes many of the key concepts covered in this report, including traceability, certification, and supplier engagement. We also ask companies about their exposure to risk and to any opportunities that arise for them related to commodity sourcing. As reported by Supply Chain, in 2015 we found that 75% of the responding companies identified substantive supply chain related business risks, including reputational, operational, and regulatory risk. This is key because understanding risks can help companies more effectively design their commodity management programs and make commitments that make their business stronger and more resilient. Many companies on the line will know that the 2016 CDP reporting cycle is underway, and in fact they may be hearing from me some daily. We will report out on our findings in December, but rest assured it's not too late to disclose if you haven't yet. You may know that our official investor deadline was at the end of June, but for purposes of sharing information with a huge variety of stakeholders, such as Supply Chain and Supply Chain's readers, we can provide extensions for another month or so. We also provide companies with detailed feedback and benchmarking for those that want to understand how their commodity management program stacks up against those of competitors. And I'll take any further questions at the end of the presentation.
Great, Jillian, and thanks very much for that. I just have one quick question for you as follow-up, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. Just if you could, I mean, if there's a company that's reporting information into, I guess, any of the roundtables for palm or soy or any other mediums, how easy is it for companies to transfer over information also to be able to disclose into CDP?
Yeah, great question, Stephen. It's very simple, actually. We ask companies about their strategy for reporting and tracking progress. So that can include things like what is being reported to RSPO or another roundtable, or even another stakeholder that's asking, investors or others who are asking for information. I mean, CDP is really meant to be kind of a one-stop shop and a place where a company could consolidate all of the information that they might be sharing on one particular commodity or with one particular audience into a centralized place to share with the sort of wide array of stakeholders who are interested in this topic.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Jillian. I'm sure we'll have some more questions at the end of this, but as you mentioned in the beginning of your remarks, I mean, we're really pleased that CDP is part of this project, and really do encourage companies to consider all forms of reporting. But one of the benefits of CDP is the standardization, the global recognition that the system does have. So. Anyway, we'll move on to the next presenter, and Leah, if you could unmute Marco, that would be great, because he is next in line. Marco, can you give us a quick mic test?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. Fantastic, Marco. So what we have here is a slide that's just showing your bio. So So we don't have any slides for Marco, and the format for the rest of the webinar is going to be a little bit more of a open dialogue rather than slide by slide. So we'll leave it on this for your comments, Marco, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Steven. So here you have an ex-consultant without slides, which is actually a pretty scary thought. But I thought I'd just give you a sense of what Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 does and why we're part of this conversation. First of all, I just want to commend Supply Chain for putting together such an interesting set of data and information. We are basically a platform for action at TFA 2020, and so this is actually extremely helpful to our membership and to me and my team in the Secretariat as a strategic tool to understand where most of the action is needed. Basically, what TFA 2020 is it's a platform that was set up and put together on the back of the commitment of the Consumer Goods Forum. And then I see we have Ignasi from CGF, the Consumer Goods Forum, speaking next. And then CGF meant, I don't want to steal your thunder, Ignasi, but I think it was actually quite informative and for, I think, this conversation, the transformative commitment that CGF made to actually get to zero deforestation by 2020 in 4 key commodities, which are the ones we've been talking about through this presentation, and on palm, beef, soy, and paper and pulp. And on the back of that commitment, there was the realization that to achieve that result, it's actually necessary often to collaborate for corporates that are trying to clean up their supply chains, to collaborate with governments, to collaborate with NGOs, to collaborate with donors and other multi-stakeholder platform, and that's the origin of TFA 2020. Now today, TFA 2020 is a collaboration of over 80 partners. There's 9 countries, about 35 companies, and about 36 companies and about 36 civil society organizations that range from large environmental NGOs to smallholder farm organizations to international organizations. We focus very much on creating partnerships that work to get to the unblocking of the things that get in the way of getting to a deforestation-free supply chain. And these are things like uncertainty about where to find suppliers, but more than that is generally the collaboration environment, the environment on the ground where the companies work with their suppliers, and especially the collaboration with the civil society organization in tropical forest countries and with the government of tropical forest countries that in the end have control on land use allocation, or at least they have the right to make decisions about how land use is allocated. And the reason why that's important is because the fundamental risk, I think, in this space through the supply chain movement, the one that actually is trying to tackle the deforestation effort from a supply chain point of view, is what some have called a market bifurcation. Firstly, where you end up with consumers that care about deforestation buy commodities that are deforestation-free from companies that are able to get deforestation-free supplies, while consumers who don't care are able to buy products from companies that don't care, and deforestation is still going on. And because deforestation has been going on for a while, that's actually a very realistic and possible outcome, very real possible outcome that you could get if you don't actually get collaboration, buy-in, and participation and an upside from producing companies, from indigenous people, from forest communities, and from forest countries, so that indeed the creation of deforestation-free supply chains becomes an alternative and better rural development pathway from the existing one. So that's really what we're focusing on. We're focusing on creating an opportunity for the companies to work with governments, with civil society organizations to create better rural development opportunities through their supply chain choices. The supply chain work is extremely interesting to us because it gives us a strategic perspective, gives to our members a strategic perspective of where the commitments have made, what progress is being made, even with all the caveats that the previous presenters have made about the fact that companies report what works and they don't necessarily report what does not work. But that gives us a sense of how fast we're moving towards achieving the commitments and where do we actually need to focus on. Interestingly, a lot of our work so far has been on palm, and especially being at the new frontier of palm in Africa. We have now begun to work more intentionally and more extensively on soy and beef, especially in Brazil. We have a dedicated working group in Brazil. We're setting up regional leadership and regional coordination platforms. And although TFA has been around as an alliance since 2012, we really had a step change last year with the creation of a full-time secretariat here at the World Economic Forum. So many of our initiatives are relatively new. We see this work that supply chain is doing, as well as the work that CDP is doing, as really fundamental to create the transparency in where things stand. But we also see the need to then create opportunities to work across the supply chains and the value chains of an individual company to tackle those barriers that are in the way of actually getting to deforestation-free supply chains at scale, and without getting that market bifurcation I was talking about. One of the most interesting areas of discussion today is the one of jurisdictional sourcing and jurisdictional action to get deforestation-free jurisdictions where you can actually source from the entire jurisdiction. You know that that area is deforestation-free. The reason why that's very interesting is because, first of all, it addresses many of the barriers to achieving deforestation-free commodities at the scale at which decisions around land use are made. And the second is that it ensures you that actually you're not simply picking, one producer that is not deforesting, next to it there's another one that actually is, and you get all that messiness that comes from that, because you might think that you're actually rewarding good behavior, but you might just be rewarding somebody who had the opportunity to deforest before, right, and simply has land that has been cleared in the past at the expense of somebody who's clearing now. And you're working in a frame of really regional and rural development. That's not something that companies can do on their own, but it's something for which they absolutely need a collaborative platform, and that's what we're trying to offer. In terms of the role that we play for commitments and getting more commitments, especially is an important thing. I think most of our role is actually to show that if you make commitments, those commitments then can be realistically achieved. And that there are people who can help you actually transform their commitment into real action. I think today there's a lot of concern on the fact that commitments are not turning into action fast enough, and that makes actually people shy to make new commitments. And achieving success and being able to show that certain supply chains, certain fraction of supply chains, certain regions have been able to meet those commitments, I think it's a quite powerful tool. In the end, this is going to be successful if it is embraced as a movement by tropical forest countries, by tropical forest civil society, by those who basically live and operate at the forest frontier, not as it's perceived as largely Western buyers imposing their values and imposing their procurement standards on others without actually giving anything in exchange for that. And so I think that a lot of effort needs to go into creating opportunities that then translate into a narrative of sustainable supply chains as a better form of rural development. If we don't actually achieve that, and we don't actually have a clear and attractive value proposition for the communities, for the people, for the politicians as well, who are in charge of running land use decisions in tropical forest regions, I think we'll actually have a very hard time translating this commitment into the success that we hope to have and that we need because of the fundamental importance of achieving deforestation-free production to our future climate. I'm going to pause here. I actually don't have a lot more specific information to give, and probably it's better to leave time for discussion.
Perfect, perfect, Marco, and a lot of those comments are fantastic, and we'll come back to those in the Q&A. We do have a number of questions coming in on the chat, so thanks very much for everybody who's supplying those, and everybody else, obviously feel free to contribute into that chat box, and any questions you have, we'll get to those in just a bit. So why don't we pass it along to the next speaker, which is Ignasi from the Consumer Goods Forum. Leah, if you don't mind to just unmute Ignasi so that we can get him going here.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. And I will echo Marco's words on congratulating you for a comprehensive, professional, and very user-friendly report. So that I wanted to do that first. Good day, everybody. Ignasi with the Consumer Goods Forums. I assume some of you know the organization. If not, there's a wonderful webpage that will teach you all about the Consumer Goods Forum, but let me leave you with the idea that it's a global platform that brings together retailers and manufacturers with the aim to secure consumer trust, working on positive business actions mainly. So we have 4 pillars. One of them is sustainability, which is the one I lead. What we do at the pillar is to regularly bring members together, again, retailers and manufacturers. We have about 400 members, but in reality, food and beverage companies to whom these commodities are important is half of them. So we bring them together to discuss implementation, best practices, and always in a non-competitive way. We adopted the Zero Net Deforestation in 2010 as a resolution. Our resolutions are non-legally binding as per our statutes. We normally organize working groups to help provide direction and look for solutions to these specific challenges within deforestation, and again in a non-competitive way. So, I mean, a few reflections after reading your report. The big question in here is how can we turn all this collective commitment into real tangible action on the ground? So obviously we get asked a lot about where our members are with regards to the implementation, especially on zero net deforestation. Unfortunately and honestly, it's not an easy question to answer. However, this past month, actually, 3 third-party organizations have published reports on our deforestation commitments. The first one, of course, from Supply Chain Forest Trends. The second was published by the Global Canopy Program and the Carbon Disclosure Project. And the third one, with a very eloquent title by WWF, The Slow Road to Sustainability. So clearly, we are being discussed, which means probably that we're being noticed. A few things that did stick out from these reports, or especially the one from Supply Chain to me. The question of progress. It is obviously very difficult to track progress on zero net. There's no agreed upon assessment standard for zero net deforestation. This doesn't necessarily mean that companies are not doing something, but it does raise the question of what are they doing. I was very glad to hear, Ben, that more commitments from companies have come out last year, so it means there's progress. And the supply chain team noted that disclosure on progress toward commitment is still insufficient. But through the report, they also noted that Of companies active on palm oil, 61% have adopted pledges, compared to 19% only on soy. So I think the reports generally agree that change is happening, but obviously much more needs to be done. We still have 4 years to meet 2020 commitment, but the available data obviously suggests that it's going to be a challenge, which brings me to the next reflection, which is transparency. I think transparency is the foundation to any good commitment, as the supply chain report correctly points out. As an organization, CGF, built on knowledge and best practice sharing, this is extremely important to us. It is nice to see that our members are acting and some leading the way here, but it is also clear that not enough members are doing their part. There's a number of gaps that need to be addressed. Our more engaged members are leading the way, but we also acknowledge that we need to perhaps showcase some of the successes so others can learn from them. And the last point is collaboration, building on what Marco was talking about, and both of us being a multi-stakeholder organization. Without the willingness of our retailers and manufacturers to collaborate on these non-competitive issues, the CGF wouldn't really exist. So there is an acknowledgement in these reports that the role that CGF is playing leading the approach to issues like deforestation has helped. We also helped obviously co-found the TFA, and we maintain our active working groups on the 4 commodities from the report. The development of tools such as the sustainable soy and palm oil and paper and pulp sourcing guidelines is extremely useful for members. And then obviously the soy ladder as well, to identify where soy is present in your supply chain. So, I mean, in short, it all means that we have a lot of work to do. I'm really happy to see these reports. They serve as reminders that complex and super obscure commodity supply chains need more collaborative efforts to overcome all these difficult challenges that companies can honestly not tackle on their own. The report also shows that as an organization, we're still driving positive change, and even though it may not always be the quickest, it is still taking place. I think I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Ignacio, and thank you for all your your hard work at the Consumer Goods Forum and for these very, I guess, practical and realistic comments that you provided here in your discussion, which again we'll come back to some of these things when we get into the Q&A at the end. But it is very good work that the Consumer Goods Forum is doing, and we do appreciate these group commitments. And then when companies take it a step further to establish their own internal commitment, which is what we utilize in order to be able to develop a profile for these companies. So moving on to our final speaker of the webinar, Toby. Thanks so much. I'll let you take it away, and then we'll end the conversation with a Q&A.
Stephen, thank you so much, and thanks to all of the other speakers and to all of you listening out there for joining us this afternoon. I'm very conscious that I'm the only barrier between you guys and getting your questions asked and answered. So I'll be as quick as I can. At Innovation Forum, we try to bring together companies, NGOs, and other key experts and stakeholders in a sort of non-PowerPoint free set of environments to discuss all sorts of supply chain issues, and then we do publishing to support that. You can Google us if you're interested in more. I won't say much more about us. I do think it's very important, as other speakers have mentioned, to acknowledge the tremendous progress made by companies in this space since about 2012. I remember at the first conference we held on how business can prevent deforestation back in 2014, one of the key NGOs said, if you'd told me 2 years ago we'd all be sitting here having this conversation, I'd have asked, what have you been smoking? And that was in 2014, and here we are in 2016 with 4 or 5 amazing years of progress. But it's also very obvious to all of us that we're only at the very beginning of this tackling deforestation in these areas and these particular commodities. And the key challenge, I think, for companies is obviously turning that on the ground performance, turning the policies into on the ground performance. And what we really want to avoid is what I might call the child labour example, where if I look at another industry I've followed for 15 years or so, apparel and other areas of retail, also relevant to agriculture, 15 years after companies said that we have child labour-free supply chains, those examples of child labour are still popping up all over the place. So it's very important that we don't end up in that situation with deforestation, particularly given how few forests are left compared to what we used to have. So my first point is very briefly about innovation. I do think that whilst the incentives for change are improving, we need a lot more creative thinking to keep catalysing change in those sort of lower brackets of companies who aren't yet where the leaders are. And that's becoming obvious, I think, from the supply chain forest trends work, that we're starting to see the smaller companies lagging behind. And the question is, how do you incentivize them? And I think we could probably legitimately argue that some of the campaigners, brand campaigns, might be less effective against some of those companies. There are only so many YouTube videos you can do with orangutans on, and they become a lot less effective on a smaller Brazilian or Uruguayan or Argentinian or Malaysian firm than they might do on Nestle or Unilever, as we've seen in the past. And of course, some of these campaigns can even backfire. If I think about the case of Resolute versus Greenpeace, we can see their limitations can become clearer. So it's very obvious to us, I think, from the research that we've done over the last few years, that these commodities are very, very different from each other, particularly the differences with soy and cattle from palm oil and timber. And I think the kind of pressures used to catalyse action, referring to the campaigner example, are going to have to be very different in these sectors beyond the Amazon, because there's only so many times one can use the Amazon examples, particularly in other areas where the landscapes are very different and there aren't quite so many fluffy animals to put on social media. So there are some really serious challenges here beyond the Amazon and Southeast Asian rainforests to base awareness-raising campaigns around. And innovation in these areas is going to be very, very important, but it's also important we don't demonize these commodities and create a very defensive approach from some of these smaller companies and some of these other countries around the world. And on the beef side of things, I recently did a Q&A with Chris Willey. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Chris Willey's work. He's now doing some work with the Grasslands Alliance on sustainable beef, and they look to be creating a really interesting model, which isn't necessarily the same as what's happened in Brazil or Southeast Asia. So I commend innovation in other areas because we're clearly going to need that. Also, McDonald's, of course, have been really leading the way in helping create a standard on global sustainable beef, which is highly commendable. So the second point is about learning lessons. I think recent events in Southeast Asia particularly show that there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and I would urge anyone in the research and publications area to focus on these current lessons, which I think can be learned. I'm speaking primarily, I suppose, about IPOP's demise, although IPOP seems to have come about more or less by accident and underestimated national and local regional business political power, and also underinvested in defence and offence. We can see that the what some people might call the failure of IPOP, or others might say the progress to its own demise of IPOP, teaches us, or will have a lot of lessons for making some of these commitments stick on the ground, that actually much of it has to come from a more local power base rather from a desire to put something out there for a UN summit or something. In the case of IOI in palm oil, I think there's some really interesting lessons to be learned there. A very serious reaction to punishment for lack of progress, and then a huge overreaction from them. And it's great to find out recently that IOI is correcting that course, albeit it's going to take some time, and they are, I believe, much better advised at a very senior level from where they were a few months ago. And that leads me to make a quick point about awareness in boardrooms. I mean, if we have CEOs of forestry companies, palm oil companies, beef companies who aren't quite understanding the potential of a market reaction on their share price and sales by not following through on sustainability. I think as a group we perhaps haven't done a good enough job at reaching the boardroom with some hard numbers on risk. And I was thinking before this call, you know, how could we do that better? And I would cite the example of Michael Porter. Michael Porter, an academic who didn't have much to do with CSR for a long time, as he would call it, and then created something called shared value, which many of us sort of disputed that it was anything new. But nevertheless, it gets on the cover of Harvard Business Review and at forums like the World Economic Forum, and suddenly CEOs you've never heard of are quoting this. So perhaps we need to focus on the communication angle of the successes that forest trends and supply chain are tracking, much more in these sorts of mediums. I don't know how that can be done, although I do have perhaps a few ideas we could discuss later. But I do think getting these issues in front of the more mainstream media is going to be a lot more helpful in raising awareness about risk and opportunity at senior levels. A couple of final quick points, and I'll hand back to you, Stephen. I think the transparency versus certification area in achieving these targets that we've been talking about is going to be vital. We're very reliant on certification, although we all are aware, I think, of how clearly it has limits, and some people might say it's pushing enormous costs and a broken system of expensive audits into the supply chain and hoping for the best. Others might argue, you know, we've seen some substantive progress. As so often, the answer, I think, is somewhere in the middle. But I'm a bit concerned that the beyond certification debate, which was, I think, catalysed by Scott Poynton at the Forest Trust, is increasingly turning in the hands of others into a debate back into certification and beyond. So I think I'd just make a call for innovation and for more data and understanding of the mechanisms and technologies that can lead to transparency that enables better business and improve sustainability outcomes rather than third-party box ticking. And we know some companies like Nestle, Unilever and others are making some really significant progress here. 3M is another one. There are lots of other examples. But we need to, I think, keep focusing on that, because certification perhaps works as an initial catalyst, but in many other sectors that we've looked at, you know, a deep dive into the supply chain, there just is no substitute for that. So we need to think also about how the certification bodies are going to adapt to this need for deep transparency. And just finally, I'd make a point about the multi-stakeholder models, and can the ones that have been successful, can they be taken to scale? And at our conference in April this year in DC, we had a long conversation with many companies and NGOs about the Brazil model. How could that work in Southeast Asia? And it's become very obvious that these models need to be enormously adapted and made to work with local cultures. Again, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think the companies who want to achieve the targets we're talking about in this webinar are going to have to help support through time, through financial support, bringing out the key lessons from say Brazil and where it's worked in areas of soy and areas of leather or beef, and looking at, okay, how do we take those elsewhere? And I think that's the sort of work that the Grasslands Alliance and Chris Willey are trying to do. So we also have to think, finally, I think, about the role of the traders. I've long bemoaned to the campaign groups, Oxfam and others, that they focus relentlessly on the brands. And while I understand why they do that, the role of the traders still seems a little bit neglected to me. I think they are allowed a bit more leeway than perhaps they might in terms of developing a proper strategy, and I'd like to see more focus on how their influence can be better used than today. And you know, in the case of the soy moratorium, you know, Cargill was a key player there. So let's think about how do those companies, how do other companies in that space, how can they take some of those lessons and move the market on.
Thank you very much, Toby, and you know, as expected, the wide range of conversations and dialogues that Innovation Forum facilitates and gets to be a part of has clearly given you some great perspective on things here. So thanks very much for sharing those. And we have about 20 minutes that we can take to go through some of these questions. I guess I should just be, you know, forewarning everybody that we have likely more questions than we'll be able to get to, but we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. One common theme that did come up throughout some of these questions here has been asking for the speakers to reflect a bit more on, I guess, kind of a combination question of how are companies or multi-stakeholder initiatives working collaboratively with government, and then potentially, you know, how does that lend to the ability of jurisdictional or landscape schemes or other types of efforts to bring these policies into a more achievable platform that companies have set for achieving zero deforestation, both at the downstream side, but also at the upstream side in these tropical forest countries. So I've unmuted all of the speakers, and Marco, you mentioned a bit about this in your remarks. So if you want to start off with any follow-up thoughts you have there, feel free, and then anybody else just feel free to chime in on with your comments.
Steve, can you just tell me again what you want me to comment on?
Yeah. So we're trying to. I mean, TFA is in a great position because of its diverse membership of government, not-for-profit, and business, as well as NGO. And a couple of the questions that have come through have been to ask about how governments can interact more with businesses on achieving their zero deforestation goals, and potentially also to continue any additional comments you might have around the role that landscapes or jurisdictional approaches can have in helping the cost of these things both on the implementation side.
Okay. Sorry for not catching that first. So I think government have a huge role to play, because in the end they are the ones who, in many of these countries, the private sector, it doesn't really make decisions on land allocation, right? And this is especially true in Asia, but also in Africa. There's a bit more private sector direct decision making on land in Latin America because of land ownership, but even there, we know the biggest drop in deforestation we've seen in Brazil was on the back of basically the soy moratorium, but also step up of enforcement by the Brazilian government. So the government, the national governments in the tropical forest countries have a fundamental role of setting a level playing field, or at least a reasonable playing field for those who are trying to meet these commitments. So that, first of all, they're able to do that and still be within the realms of laws and regulation that they need to abide to. Because if, for example, you're going to lose your concession if you don't clear land that is classified as a high carbon value or high conservation value, a high carbon stock, then it will be very difficult for you to comply with that kind of regulation if the certification standards are in conflict with, again, land use allocation practices, or if the taxation is counterproductive towards what you're trying to achieve, then it's going to be harder for companies to comply in your own supply chain, or to get your suppliers to comply. Because in most of the supply chains, actually, in the end, the deforestation decisions are taken by not the brand owners, but by suppliers of the brand owners, or by suppliers of the brand owners. So you need to convince those suppliers that actually they need to change their practices, they need to decide not to clear their land banks and concentrate on improving productivity on land that has already been cleared. This is especially important when we're actually talking about improving productivity of smallholder farmers, which is a critical piece of the puzzle here, especially in the palm sector. But improvement in productivity is a critical piece of the puzzle also in the beef and the soy supply chains. And I would venture to say also in the paper and pulp supply chain, there's a huge productivity improvement opportunity. At least if we think about productivity in terms of like the not just the cost footprint and not just the land footprint, but also the biodiversity footprint of production. Those productivity improvements, especially if carried out by smallholders or even kind of small medium-sized enterprises, agricultural enterprises, have on one hand a huge potential of actually creating a much better rural development opportunity in those countries. On the other hand, they require the engagement of government organizations because rural development, by and large, is done by governments. That's the way rural development is done, through government support, through all sorts of incentives, and disincentive is rural credits. And that's the way it's done in Europe, by the way. It's the way it's done in the United States. I mean, there would be no small farmers in the West if there were not for the support of the European Union Common Agriculture Policy or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the small farmer tax credit, all these things that we actually take for granted. They also exist in tropical forest countries, and they actually need to be aligned with a different fundamental paradigm, which is one of a sustainable production and sustainable increase of agriculture productivity. That becomes then a huge point of support towards the companies who are trying to source their agriculture products sustainably. So I think that's really where the role is. There is also obviously a role for international organizations and development partners. So in terms of providing blended capital and blended finance, aligning overseas and official development assistance towards this kind of objectives and making sure that they work hand in hand. And here's a lot of the jurisdictional level activity where we can then see the supply chain commitments coming together with the carbon finance or development, rural development finance, payment for performance support on the forest side in a jurisdiction, so that you know, as you're actually moving towards a better rural development paradigm, you get rewarded both by actually getting offset agreements and contracts for your commodity production and getting the kind of international support that you need towards your legal reform, your agriculture extension program, your agriculture training program, seed selection, and so on, that you actually need to deliver this kind of transformation. So there's a huge role for government, and there's a huge role for civil society, and it moves beyond the ministries of environment. I think that is not just boardrooms, and I very much agree with Tobias that we need to have a better conversation in the boardrooms, and these are not just the boardrooms of the handful of really engaged kind of progressive companies, but it's also the boardrooms of the companies that are mostly operating in the early stages of the supply chain. Many of them are domestic companies. It's in the boardrooms of the commercial banks in tropical forest countries, and is in the ministries of agriculture, is in the ministries of finance, is where fiscal policy is decided, is where agriculture policy is decided. It's not just the Ministry of Environment. And an engagement that is focused just on ministries of environment and environmental agencies, I think it's missing a big piece of what needs to be done.
Great. Well, thanks, Marco. Yeah, those are all excellent points. I would like to ask others for their comments on this, but I think we have other questions. It would be good to move into some of those. And something that's come up a few times from people on the chat has been around really understanding examples of companies that are, you know, going beyond just setting the commitments, but have actually demonstrated, you know, realistic and I guess identifiable progress on removing deforestation, acknowledging that many companies set certification goals or policies for a portion of their commodity production or consumption, but are there companies, and this could really be, I guess, for Ignacio and also you know, Jillian to comment on, is the companies that you work with, are there those that are really out in front of the pack that can serve as those case study examples and what your organizations are doing to help tell those stories.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, a number of companies are obviously the front runners in this, and it'll be difficult for me to single out any of them. In general, I mean, there's the belief, and I agree with Toby on the role of certification. I think credible commodity certification schemes have been a first step for many of these companies because they brought confidence to the consumer and they brought all the actors together. However, there's only a percentage we can achieve through certification. So I see a move from companies perhaps going into the scale-up of initiatives. Marco mentioned the jurisdictional approach. This is one of the approaches that we are exploring because obviously it's one of the best ways to de-risk agricultural intensification and expansion and reconciling the competing land use interest. But obviously there's a number of limitations that companies are finding in implementing these, geographical boundaries and et cetera. But overall, yes, there is a pack of front runners, and then obviously a number of learners that are watching this space. Hopefully through platforms like the CGF, we are providing those learners with tools so they can catch up with the rest.
Jillian, just before I ask you to kind of give some comments, I mean, I would say that we do urge companies to take a look at supply chain company profiles, and particularly, you know, if your company does have a commitment for one commodity, looking to do one for a different one, and you can see companies within your peer sector and what they've committed to. You know, we try to make this as free to access and ready to available or ready to view as possible. But we do not take that additional step to then rank or score or qualify any companies and their policies and commitments. So that's really left up to some of these other organizations, and I guess that's maybe a tee up for you, Jillian, is just to talk about you know, how CDP Force is evolving to be more transparent and around recognizing the companies that are leading and what those you know, good stories are.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. We do hesitate, like Ignasi, to single out individual companies, although CDP does recognize leaders each year, and in 2015 we recognized a handful of leaders based on what they reported through CDP. So by sector, we looked at companies that were really standing out from the pack, and you know, there are a handful of those that you can check out in our 2015 Global Forest Report. Companies like Kimberly-Clark here in the U.S. In the consumer durables and personal product space, companies like Unilever and food and beverage processing, Marks and Spencer. So, you know, a variety of companies that we recognize as leaders, but I think you know, importantly, what we're looking at are some of the specifics, and I think that's part of what the question was, how are companies actually moving beyond these commitments to implementing them, and what are the specific actions they're taking. So one of the things that we've done is actually look at what are the hallmarks of some of these leading companies, what are the things they're doing that help them drive their commitments forward and help them meet these specific time-bound commitments. And one of the things we really focused on from last year's responses was around how companies are implementing with their, or working with their procurement team and driving progress through their procurement practices. So, you know, engaging suppliers is, you know, kind of is obvious, but what that means is different for every company, and so we looked at some specific metrics around setting, you know, procurement standards, but also doing things like training procurement teams on what sustainable policies imply for their commodity sourcing. And actually it was surprising how few companies really did that. I think something like 5 companies across all of the hundreds reporting were really doing training hands-on with their sourcing teams. So, you know, that's some of the things we're looking for in terms of specific leading behavior. So addressing things like legality, establishing traceability, certification, you know, all the things we've been talking about, but are you really implementing them and driving them through your procurement practices? And that's something we're hoping to help companies drive further. I mentioned we're going to be working to help companies collect supplier data. So I think that's a big part of it, having the information that allows companies to understand what their suppliers are doing and how they can better incentivize that through their purchasing standards. And then, as you sort of alluded to, Stephen, we are going to be sort of doing a more comprehensive reporting out on the progress that companies are making. So in the past, we've only reported a few leaders, some of those companies I mentioned a minute ago. Starting this year, we are going to do public scoring for companies. So those companies who reported by the official deadline or who report in the next month or so, and specifically, you know, intend to have their score communicated out to the public, those companies will be ranked publicly, and so we'll be able to, I think, talk in greater detail about specific companies and how they're doing, and those who are really leading, what are the practices we see them, you know, communicating over time.
Thanks very much, Jillian. And I'm going to quickly move on to the final question, which and just keep in mind, this is not totally in order, but this is just to give everybody a chance to have an answer to some questions here. But it's the last one I have is for Toby, who mentioned that there are key lessons that can be learned from the work that has been done in Brazil, and specifically the question is, what are those key lessons that can be transferred and adapted to Southeast Asia?
That's a great question, Stephen. I wish I had all the answers. We had a session on it in April, and we had a number of researchers and academics who pointed out that the more voluntary, non-regulatory arrangements in areas of Brazilian commodities had been more successful than implementation of, I think it was the Forest Code. And so there was great excitement earlier this year and late last year when a couple of academic institutions produced some research pointing this out, in that we could see that while government enforcement is obviously a challenge that takes many years to bring up to speed, some of these voluntary agreements around beef and soy can have a greater impact in a shorter period of time because incentives become aligned. In the case of beef, I believe a lot of it was about transparency and traceability through slaughterhouses as middlemen between the final destination and the sourcing of beef in the Amazon, and traceability and tracking as to where beef came from at the slaughterhouse level was something that enabled a great deal of progress to be made. There's been a lot of this written about. I don't know the full answer to your question. All I know is that more good research is appearing that some of these voluntary agreements can be successful, and I think there's a key challenge ahead for companies and others to help fund and contribute to this kind of research so that we can figure out this question. But I would also suggest you ask that question to Chris Willey, because he's been doing this for 30 years and he would know the answer better than me.
Oh, perfect, Toby, and I mean definitely helpful information there. So I know that we're now at the mark of the end of the webinar. So I don't want to over-consume your time, both the speakers but also the attendees. So we do want to thank everybody very much for both providing your comments and wisdom as speakers, but everybody else who's attended today's webinar. We've got a ton of questions here that we didn't get to, and definitely apologize for not being able to do that. We're not going to commit to this, but what we're going to do is I'm going to follow up the speakers and the organizations that are part of this after the call and see if we can collate all these great questions and see if we can get some answers together as a follow-up. So again, I'm not committing to it, but we'll see what we can do to try to get these questions answered in full. In the meantime, feel free to reach out to Ben McCarthy or myself, or contact the general information email URL that you see right there. If you have any questions at all about the project, how we can potentially collaborate, if there's additional data insights that we can help you, pull from the website, more than happy to see how we can help you and your organizations do more to achieve the end goal of eliminating deforestation from these commodity value chains and supporting the companies and governments and financial institutions in doing so. So from Supply Chain and Forest Trends, and on behalf of all the other speakers, thanks very much for attending this webinar, and thank you very much to Innovation Forum for being our co-host. It's been an absolute pleasure to work together, and looking forward to the next time we can all collaborate. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.